This is the American Ag Network. I'm Rusty Halvorson. Today we're at the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame in Medora, joined by a very special guest, author Rolf Sletten. How are you doing today, Rolf?
Oh, doing very well. Thank you. It's good to be here.
We're celebrating the National Day of the Cowboy this weekend, and you're very familiar with the Medora area with your books that you've written. For anybody who has been to Medora and stayed in the Rough Rider Hotel, they may see one of your books about the Maltese Cross Ranch, Elkhorn Ranch. I've got it in my lap right now. How many years of research went into this book, and has it been a work of love for you?
It's definitely a work of love, and the answer to the first question is the book took me about 2.5 years to research and write it. I can't say that I worked on it as a full-time job during that entire period, but I was fairly diligent about it. So.
And when you talk about Teddy Roosevelt and Medora and the history of the place, when people come here, the history comes to life all those over a century ago, but it's like you're right back into it.
Well, people come to Medora for many, many different reasons. Some come to see the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Some come for the musical. Some come to drive around in the park and look at the buffalo. But the history is an extremely important part of what we're doing here, the essence of Medora. And it was really the reason that I started writing the books, because I had this impression that people would come to town for a couple of days and they'd leave and they'd know very little about the history. They kind of had this vague notion that Theodore Roosevelt had a couple ranches here back in the 1880s. I don't think most people knew where they were, how far away they were, how big they were, anything about them. They were very big. They knew a little bit about the Marquis de Maurice, and maybe some of them, if they were from North Dakota, knew that in about the 1960s, a guy named Harold Schaefer came along, started reviving the place. But there's so much more to the history of Medora than just that. Now, clearly, Theodore Roosevelt is the centerpiece because he's the most important, most influential person who ranched here. But there are many, many other characters, kind of the supporting cast, that are equally as fascinating, or almost as fascinating.
Medora was built on a dream. They had a grand idea of shipping beef on the rails, refrigerated down to Chicago and beyond, and it didn't quite work out the first time around.
No, it didn't work out. It was a grand dream, that's for sure, a dream on the grand scale. That, of course, was the Marquis de Maurice idea. He was only 24 years old. Theodore Roosevelt was only 24 years old when he came here. These were very young people. Most of the people here at that time were very young. But in any event, as you say, the Marquis' idea was that he would slaughter beef out here on the Western Range and send finished beef to New York in refrigerated cars rather than to ship live cattle to Chicago. And since only about 40% of a cow is finished beef, on paper, it made a lot of sense, but it was fraught with problems. For one thing, to make the meatpacking plant successful, he had to be able to slaughter beef year-round. And of course, grass-fed, range-fed beef are only really ready to slaughter in the fall. That was a real fundamental problem. I'm not quite sure why he overlooked that one. Then he had another problem in that discovered that people in New York or on the East Coast didn't really like grass-fed beef so much. They were used to eating grain-fed beef, so it didn't sell very well. And then he probably was sabotaged by some of his competitors too. And then he was kind of his own worst enemy. He had a lot of great ideas, but he was very poor on follow-through. And so, as a result of all of those, combination of all of those things, the meatpacking plant didn't last very long. But that is the reason that the town of Medora was founded.
And it was a kind of a novel idea because they took ice from the river. I mean, refrigerated cars back over 100 years ago, they had to get the ice from somewhere, took it from the river in the winter and had a big storehouse, sawdust and whatnot. So interesting.
Yeah, that's all exactly correct. The Marquis built a small dam across the Little Missouri River. We don't know exactly where it was, but very, very close here to where the town of Medora is. So he had a little lake to harvest ice from. And when you look at the models or the pictures of the meatpacking plant and you see all those big buildings, much of that was ice storage. And the ice was packed in sawdust, as you say.
You can see some of the remnants still of the packing plant here when you walk around town.
Yeah, the abattoir, the foundation of the abattoir is still there, and of course one of the most famous landmarks in Medora is the chimney that still stands from that meatpacking plant.
And if you walk over that chimney, it's big.
It is a big chimney. I'm sure the plant was an impressive thing.
And when you look at the old pictures, growing up back then, it was such a hard time. And when you say these were young men, it was a hard life back then.
It was a very hard life, a very, very hard life. I am a huge fan of the Old West, but it doesn't mean that we really want to live during that time. There are a lot of things about that are really romantic and fascinating, but it was a very, very difficult life. Just surviving, I think, was tough. Staying warm, staying fed, earning any amount of money at all. Tough time.
Well,
but fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you for your time here in an air-conditioned North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame. Thank you, Rolf.
Thank you very much. It's a beautiful place, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I'm Rusty Halvorson from the American Ag Network.